Shalom and welcome to Shikul Da'at. I'm Rabbi Josh Rose. The Torah portion this week contains the famously difficult story of Pinchas, the zealot who kills on behalf of God. Actually, Pinchas' act of violence takes place last week at the end of the Torah portion. An Israelite has sex with a Midianite, and the rabbinic tradition tells us this is done repeatedly, deliberately and audaciously in front of everybody. Pinchas, there, at the end of last week's Torah portion, leaps up and kills them both in flagrante delicto, thrusting a spear through both of their bodies. And then, this week's Torah portion starts like this. Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aharon HaKohen eshiv et chamatime al bnei Yisrael. God says, Pinchas, the son of Elazar, the son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my anger from the Israelites. And then it says, Bekan'o et kinati betocham. We're going to look at this phrase very carefully through this podcast, but it's translated here as something like, by taking on my passion or my zeal through himself among them. Velo chaliti et bnei Yisrael bekinati. So that I did not wipe out the Israelite people in my passion. Lechen emor hineni noten lo et briti shalom, God says. Therefore, I grant him my covenant of peace, briti shalom, my covenant of peace. It shall be for him and his descendants after him a pact of priesthood for all time, because he took impassioned action for his God. And impassioned there, it's that same word, kin'ah, thus making expiation for the Israelites. So on the simple level, what's being said here is that because of Pinchas' action, because Pinchas acted and immediately punished the two wrongdoers, that prevented God from having to allow God's anger, so to speak, to flare up, which might have ended up killing many more people. But for sure, this is a difficult and troubling passage in the Torah because we abhor religious violence. How can it be that Pinchas leaps up without any adjudication, without any trial, commits this murderous act, and then he's rewarded for it? It's hard for us to understand. Before we can even try to evaluate Pinchas's act or understands God's response, first let's talk about what this story is not about. This is not a story about intermarriage. I don't think we can really get the full power of the story if we view this as simply a story about religious violence in response to an Israelite having sex with a non-Israelite. Because to really appreciate it, we have to understand what it meant for this Israelite leader to go with this Midianite woman and to have sex with her in the presence of everybody. In the ancient world, an act like that was totally indistinguishable from an act of idolatry, and therefore from an act of complete betrayal of God and the Torah. And of course, what is the Torah? The Torah is the map or the model or the pathway to a beautiful and holy society. So I think that if we want to evaluate Pinchas, we have to see that he believes he's responding to a person who very publicly is flouting all that is good in the world. And if we can identify with that impulse, then we can begin to see it through Pinchas's eyes, and then we can begin to evaluate the meaning of his act. So as to Pinchas's act of violence itself, well, our tradition casts a pretty complicated light on it. If you look closely at a Sefer Torah, you'll notice two things about the actual script. One is that the letter Yud in Pinchas's name is very, very small. Just graphically, it's smaller. So some have seen this as an allusion to the four-letter name of God, which begins with the letter Yud, and that by enacting this violence, Pinchas has diminished God. You'll also see that when God awards Pinchas with the Brit Shalom, with a covenant of peace, that the Vav itself is broken. The middle part of it is missing. So there's an upper part and then a tiny little space and then the lower part of the Vav. So with the Vav broken, maybe we're being asked to question whether this is really a peace that he's enacted with this terrible act of violence, or to say that it is a compromised, literally a broken peace. So these are beautiful teachings. I like them. They're creative. They're interesting, but they don't really account for the fact that Pinchas's act of zeal, of kin'ah, is rewarded by God. God makes very clear that Pinchas is the hero of this moment. So I want to push us to focus on the kin'ah itself, on the zeal. And again, that is what Pinchas is rewarded for. God specifically identifies the fact that Pinchas's kin'ah has come up to match God's kin'ah, this zeal, or sometimes translated as anger or zealousness or jealousy on behalf of God. In a discussion in the Talmud as to whether a blemished priest can make a valid sacrificial offering, so not directly related to our topic, but the Talmud focuses on our verse, on this verse about Briti Shalom, my covenant of peace. And Shmuel takes the broken Vav to mean there that the letter Vav should not be pronounced. And then the word Shin Lamed Vav Mem would just be Shin Lamed Mem. And instead of meaning peace, it would mean whole or pure, which is what Shalem means. So what would it mean if the Talmud is suggesting that we're supposed to understand that Pinchas was being awarded or acknowledged for being Shalem? What does that mean? Well, one way to view this is that Pinchas was Shalem. He was perfect. He was wholly filled with godliness. He had identified that as totally with God. And in fact, the Torah language suggests that, because God says in the Torah regarding Pinchas, B'kan'o et kanati. His zealousness was my zealousness, is maybe a way we could interpret that. And Rashi understands this to mean something like Pinchas took vengeance through his anger, which was actually my anger, says God. In other words, Pinchas's will and God's will are one. This, by the way, would be one approach to say that Pinchas's act of violence cannot be a model for us, because it could only be justified through his complete identification with God. And since no sane person can know when their will is identified with God's will, Pinchas's act should not be permitted to anyone. But in any event, the point is that one way to view Pinchas's kin'ah is not just that it's his own personal outrage, but that somehow it represents holiness and goodness. So again, set aside the act of violence, which I think makes it very difficult for us to think about, and just focus on the passion and the outrage itself, that somehow that can be representative of God's will. Now let's talk for a minute about a seemingly unrelated part of the Torah portion, because there's another very, very important thing that happens in the Torah portion that doesn't seem to be connected to our topic, and that is that Moses transfers his authority, or takes the first step, I should say, towards transferring his authority to Joshua. And it's done with a ritual in which Moses lays his hand on Joshua, which is called smicha, and he does this in the presence of the priest, and then Joshua now is invested with the authority that Moses has. And of course, as we know, Joshua will be the successor to Moses. So that actually happens in our Torah portion. Now, God says to Moses, interestingly, take Joshua and do this in the presence of Eleazar, the priest. Who is Eleazar? Eleazar is also the father of Pinchas. So why am I bothering with this? Well, let's look a little bit at the character of Joshua. If we go back to chapter 11 of the book of Numbers, there's a strange episode in which two people are prophesying in the Israelite camp. Joshua is furious at this challenge to his master Moses' authority, and he urges Moses there to put an end to it immediately. And now listen to this. Vayomer lo Moshe, hamakane atali, umi yiten kol am Hashem nevi'am, ki yiten Hashem et rucho alehem. But Moses said to him, are you zealous on my account? And it's that same word, kinah. Would that all of God's people were prophets, that God put his spirit upon them. So Joshua here urges immediate action, and Moses urges restraint. Moses challenges Joshua's kin'ah, the same thing for which Pinchas is rewarded in our Torah portion, in which Moses invests authority in Joshua. Interesting that these two come together here. So if Pinchas and Joshua's approach is kin'ah, that is passion and urgent action motivated by outrage, what is Moses's? Well, one way to get to that is to look at another place where God's phrase to describe Pinchas is used. Remember that phrase, B'kan'o kanati, at the beginning of our Torah portion? Well, we see something almost identical in the beautiful story of Elijah in the book of Malachim, the book of Kings. So here we're leaving the Chumash, we're leaving the 5 books of Moses and looking at the prophetic section, the book of Kings, the first book of Kings. And there, Elijah is a prophet who scorns and ultimately exposes the worshipers of false gods. He's in danger at one point for his unpopular positions, and he flees for his life. He goes to, quote, Chorev, the mountain of God. This is the exact same wording used to describe the journey of Moses to Sinai, which is also called Chorev. The parallels in this story to Moses' revelation are many and unmistakable. I can't go into them here, but there's a brilliant essay called The Rise of Pinchas on Virtual Beit Midrash, which can be found at etzion.org. That's etzion.org, that you should really read, and you'll be able to learn where I got this insight and this comparison of Elijah and Moses. So there God confronts Elijah and essentially asks, what are you doing? And Elijah's answer is, Vayomer, Kano kaniti Lashem, Elokei Tzavaot, Kol azavdu v'ritcha b'nei Yisrael. I have been zealous or passionate or angry for Lord, the God of hosts. And the phrase is almost the same as the one in our Torah portion. Kano kaniti, here it says. For the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, God, thrown down your altars, and slain your prophets with the sword, and they seek my life to take it. Now, in that story, God actually seems inexplicably unmoved by Elijah's zeal. God tells him that God is not to be found in the thundering rage and the storms, but in the still, quiet voice, or sometimes translated as the still, small voice. So in contrast to Elijah, Moses represents not kin'ah, some kind of divine anger, but rather compassion and forgiveness. And I'm drawing on the idea that we're being encouraged here to compare Elijah's going to Mount Chorev with Moses' going to Mount Chorev. The two parallels in the stories urge us to compare these two religious leaders, these two prophets. And if we contrast Elijah's thundering kin'ah with Moses' approach, we find that in fact Moses was continually trying to give the Israelites a second, third, and fourth chance at changing their ways. Repeatedly, Moses advocates on their behalf in spite of the Israelites' bad behavior. And repeatedly, he kind of intervenes to prevent God from destroying the Jewish people. So Moses seems to represent whatever the opposite of kin'ah would be, that is mercy and compassion and forgiveness. So if we take these together and we look at our Torah portion, we've identified two different approaches to divine service. One is zeal, that sense of outrage that we tap into in response to our most cherished values being trampled. And in these moments of kind of flared nostril flashes of anger, we don't indulge in mitigating circumstances or credit the other party with coming from the right place or chalk it up to their faulty best efforts. No, we feel the need to stop the outrage cold. We're not interested in those moments of imagining how the other person might turn and change their ways. We just need to put an end to the bad behavior or to confront it. But another approach is the one that we haven't really detailed so much here, and that is the one that's best represented perhaps in the 13 attributes of mercy revealed to none other than Moses, in which God articulates the name that we call on for God's abundant mercy, God's repeated patience and compassionate forgiveness in the face of our continual wrongdoing and our mistakes. These are embodied by Moses, who continually advocated for our behalf, always reminded God of the better angels of our character, so to speak, that could be inspired to lift us. So, how to make sense of this paradox? Well, that's beyond the scope of this podcast, but I just want to say that there is a time for both. There are times when too much indulgence, too much understanding, too much patience can corrupt the moral fabric. There are certain wrongs, certain harms that we must not tolerate, not, of course, by employing violence, but with our own strong words and our own passion, our own zeal. But then the opposite is also true. There are times when zeal and outrage themselves are the greater danger and cause harm to the very social good that they aim to protect. I do think that finally we end up leaning very heavily on the path of Moshe. The more effective and beautiful disposition for us and for the people in our world is patience and compassion. But that's another podcast. For now, maybe it's enough just to recognize that each one is a tool that we have to know how to use at the moment of need, with an eye always towards what will bless the world with the Brit Shalom, the covenant of peace. Thanks so much for listening. Have a Shabbat Shalom.